Bienvenue, willkommen, welcome. My name is Joshua Cole, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today to this event sponsored by the Center for European Studies here at the University of Michigan. Today we have Christian Brecht, the Consul General of Germany from Chicago, and Graham Paul, also the Consul General of France, here today to discuss the challenges facing Europe, a French-German approach. And I want to start just by making a few comments about the significance of this moment and perhaps to underline how fortunate we are to have these two guests today. The year 2013 will be the 50th anniversary of the Élysée Treaty, that is, a treaty of national reconciliation signed by President Charles de Gaulle and Chancellor Konrad Adenauer of Germany in order to reestablish the basis of Franco-German cooperation in the post-war period. And of course, as we know, and perhaps this is something which needs to be emphasized again and again, that the long history of European integration that took place in the decades following the Second World War was based largely, really almost entirely, on Franco-German cooperation. The impulse came from France and Germany working together to establish the terms of this integration. After a century, of course, less than a century, in which these two nations had been at war, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Now, I emphasize this because I find in my teaching, I teach European history here at the university, that I often have to stop and underline to American students who sometimes have a little bit of difficulty in comprehending the significance of this achievement. And I sometimes stop and wonder why that might be the case, that American audiences sometimes forget how remarkable it is that European integration began at all in the way that it did. There are probably lots of reasons why an American audience might have a difficulty in understanding this. I think some of it might have to do with a lack of familiarity with the history of European integration in its early years. Some of it might also have to do with the fact that perhaps the one thing that people have heard about when they think about economic restructuring and rebuilding after the war, they think of the Marshall Plan, which of course came from the United States, and they think somehow that the United States was responsible for producing this effect. There might also be, I think, in this country, a different attitude towards perceived threats to national sovereignty posed by international institutions. It's certainly true that we have different political traditions here. Nevertheless, of course, the most important thing to understand about European integration in the post-war decades is that it was done by Europeans themselves in a context in which it was not completely obvious that it would succeed. Now, today, of course, the current European sovereign debt crisis has posed a very new set of questions about how European nations should and will relate to one another in the future. As it stands right now, there are many options on the table, many disagreements yet to be ironed out. But one thing we do know is that a solution, when and if it is found, will come through a process in which the French and the Germans sit down together and work out the ways in which they themselves can agree upon what these solutions may be. So for that reason, I'm especially delighted to introduce our speakers today. Let me just say a very few words, hardly adequate to comprehend the depth of experience that is sitting here before you. Dr. Christian Brecht, who is, as I said, the Consul General of the Federal Republic of Germany in Chicago, has had a distinguished diplomatic career. Prior to coming to Chicago, he served as Consul General in Karachi, Pakistan. And rather than list all the many offices that he held before that, I'm simply going to list the cities where he has had this experience: Ottawa, Beijing, Rangoon, Santiago, Sydney, Paris, Berlin. those are all very wonderful places, I think, to have spent one's time, and we are very anxious to hear.
And Bonn.
Sorry, I left that out. Dr. Brecht received his degree in law from Tübingen University originally, and his doctorate in law as well from the University of Geneva. Graham Paul has an equally distinguished diplomatic career. He is, as I said, the Consul General of France in Chicago. Prior to his appointment, he was deputy head of the French embassy in Berlin. He has spent a great deal of time in Germany, in Munich. His experience in Germany, in fact, included 2 years in East Berlin before the wall fell, so he had a particularly close perspective on that transition, die Wende, as they say in Germany. He has also spent time in Vienna. He was appointed deputy director of the Office of Strategic Affairs in Paris at the Quai d'Orsay, and has also served at the French embassy in Tokyo. Graham Paul holds a degree in law as well. He is a graduate of the Institute of Political Studies in Bordeaux. Please join me in welcoming our two guests.
Thank you very much, Joshua, for your kind words. Thank you to the University of Michigan, and thank you to the Center for European Studies for hosting us. Christian and myself are very happy to be here for, I will say, the first time in Ann Arbor. Thank you very much. I will talk a little bit about the political landscape, and Christian will talk afterwards about the so-called euro crisis. I stress the so-called because it's not really a euro crisis, as Christian will explain to you. So starting from the very kind words of Joshua, I would like just to draw your attention on the celebration of the French-German Élysée Treaty, which was signed on January 22nd, 1963. You will find a fact sheet trying to sum up a little bit what is it all about with this treaty and what we've done between France and Germany on this basis. Let me just quote what is for me the most important part of the treaty, that is a strong political commitment. And this commitment is the following: the two governments will consult each other prior to any decision on all important questions of foreign policy, and in the first place on questions of common interest, with a view of arriving, insofar as possible, at a similar position. So this is a very strong political commitment. That means that since 1963, each and every important decision was consulted between ourselves. Each time we are not able to reach an agreement, but each time we have tried to reach an agreement. There is no other such commitment between two countries in the world. It's very unique what we are trying to do, and it's very concrete too. I was at lunch referring to the fact that, for example, at the French Prime Minister office, you have a German diplomat acting as point of contact of liaison officer. It's the same at the French Foreign Ministry. You have a German diplomat working with our European minister, who is also the Secretary General for the FrenchGerman Cooperation. And it's the same on the German side. In Berlin, you have inside the German Foreign Ministry, you have French diplomats working to facilitate the dialogue, the ongoing dialogue between France and Germany. So what we've done, we are not discussing just to please our political masters. We are discussing to do some very concrete work. We are trying to develop some bilateral projects, but in fact, most of the time, those bilateral projects are pilot projects for the European Union. I'd just like to refer to, for example, the French-German Brigade. It was launched, in fact, to try to demonstrate that between France and Germany, it was possible to have integrated military forces. So we have a French-German brigade, and this was the core, and it's still the core of what we call the European Army Corps, which is based, the headquarters are based in Strasbourg. And today, and that's very symbolic, we do have German forces stationed in France. We were occupied by Germany 2 times, but today we have agreed with the German that some German forces will be deployed in the framework of this European Army Corps near Strasbourg. So I don't want to be too long, but you have also, of course, the EADS and Airbus project, the Schengen area, the borderless Schengen area, the Euro, which is also based on a French-German agreement, and the Lisbon Treaty, the last treaty which was signed by the European Union. I will start my very brief presentation with a very basic question. What is European Union? It's not very easy to answer. Today, it's clear that the EU is the world's single largest market. It's the home of 500 million citizens speaking 23 different languages. But more than that, it's a political body, and I'd like to stress the term political. When I'm giving talks in the US, for most of my American friends, the EU is basically a free trade zone. It's misleading because, in fact, the EU is a political construction. And so it's not a state, it's not a federation, it's not a confederation. There is no word to describe what the EU is because it's a process. It's an ongoing process. So to be even more clearer, we have not constructed the European Union to do trade between ourselves. It's not NAFTA, it's not a trade zone. We have tried to construct the European Union to achieve peace, stability, and of course, prosperity, but also to have a say in world affairs. What happened after the Second World War was that most of the European countries were feeling very strongly that they were in decline. That in fact they were all declining for obvious reasons, lack of resources, but also from the moral point of view. So we needed a grand design, a big project, to be able to go forward, and this grand project is the European Union or the European integration. In that framework, I would like to refer to the Peace Nobel Prize, which was awarded to the European Union. And this Peace Nobel Prize recognizes that, and also thanks to our American friends, the construction of Europe has enabled our countries to live the longest period of peace since the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. So Europe has been in peace since then, since the Second World War, and has been able also to project peace in its neighborhood and beyond. So I will not dwell on the economic powerhouse that Europe is and still be. But I would like to mention the fact that the EU is also a power, a political power, which is trying to promote democratic values, rule of law, and human rights for the world. But also the EU is at the forefront of the fight against poverty. The EU is, for example, the biggest donor of overseas development assistance. 60% of overseas development assistance is given by the European Union. We are fighting also against the death penalty or climate change. We are also promoting, and I think it's interesting, cultural and linguistic diversity. Perhaps you don't know that, but every European middle school student has to learn 2 foreign languages. And we do have a lot of, and we talk about that, a lot of study abroad programs. Nowadays, most of the curriculum at university are including 6 months or 1 year in a foreign country. The Lisbon Treaty I was referring to has created a more integrated foreign policy decision-making process. This kind of institutional evolutions are slow and maybe not noticed from outside, but they clearly mean that the EU is now trying to speak with a single voice. And it's very interesting to see that from Myanmar to the Middle East, from Kosovo to Somalia, 27 countries are very often, not always, but very often, able to share a common position. I would like also to refer to hard power. View from the US, the EU is a soft power. You have the European coming from Venus and the American coming from Mars. I do think that it's a bit misleading. Since 1999, the EU has been developing crisis management and rapid response military capability, what we call the Common Security and Defense Policy. The EU has carried out 24 civilian and military operations overseas, at times with the support of NATO, sometimes without the support of NATO. And I would like to stress that 21 of the 27 EU member states are also NATO members. Through the Common Security and Defense Policy, the EU meets international security challenges by sharing civilian expertise in areas such as law enforcement and local government. Similarly, boots-on-the-ground military operations help secure and stabilize post-conflict areas and fragile states. In the last 10 years, the EU has dispatched peacekeeping missions to several of the world's hotspots, such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Kosovo, Chad, Central African Republic, Congo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Today, the EU has an equivalent of the US State Department. Pierre Vimont, the former French ambassador to Washington, is at the head of the European External Action Service, which was launched in December 2010 to advance common foreign policy areas. That being said, the EU needs to face a changing environment and new challenges both from the external and the internal point of view. The internal challenges are very similar than the one that the US is facing. Terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, piracy, localized crises, major pandemics, poverty, migration, geopolitical effect of climate change. But perhaps the main challenge of our generation, of perhaps the generation of the students, will be to integrate in the new international landscape the emerging powers, the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, represent today 40% of the world population and 30% of the world GDP. Those countries, for obvious reasons, are asserting themselves, but they too often are still hesitant about taking on their full role and responsibilities, and would like to stress responsibilities. So we have a major challenge. The actors of this century are not the same as the actors of the last centuries. So we need to address that major issue. I will let my German colleague address the current economic crisis, but let me say that the internal challenges are an incentive to deepen European integration. It is the only way for the Europeans to get the scale and efficiency we need to be, or to maintain our position as a global player. It's also the only way to safeguard our values, because it's also a matter of values in a changing world. I'd like to conclude by addressing briefly the relationship between Europe and the US. The transatlantic link is deeply rooted in our common history, cultural heritage, and robust democratic values. As new powers are emerging, it's more important than ever that we work together to promote our values and that we share, and the common interests that we share. In this changing global environment, transatlantic relationship remains more important than ever. To quote Secretary of State Clinton, let me stress the importance of the, and I quote, unbreakable bond between America and Europe, a bond created by shared values and common purpose. In virtually every challenge we face today, Europe is America's partner of first resort. And let me add that the reverse is, of course, also true. This transatlantic link remains the foundation of our stability in an increasingly uncertain world. Thank you for your attention. I would like to pass the mic to my friend Christian.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know whether you would like to start some questions or discussions now or only after my little talk. So
Maybe we should have your presentation first and then open.
Oh, that's okay. It's as you like. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I would like to address also a European topic which has become increasingly, let's say, important also from a United States point of view, because very often we are hearing in Europe, especially in Germany, we are not doing enough to to overcome what's called the debt crisis, the so-called Euro crisis. And then, of course, we could answer, well, the United States is not doing enough to come out of its own crisis. And if the United States economy would be better off, we Europeans, we also could solve our crisis in a quicker and easier way. Anyway, you know from the media and from, I don't know, from university most probably, the debt crisis is very well. It's I don't want to exaggerate, but it's a deep crisis and it's not easy to overcome, and most probably there is still some time ahead before we are on the right path to overcome. But I would like to explain a little bit the German point of view. I would like to start with the origin, not of the crisis, but with the origin of the euro. And it's like a little bit Graham told you, the reason for creating the euro is not so much an economical one, but it was a political, right from the beginning, it was a political project. The main reason was that after German unification in 1989 and 1990, there were fears or apprehensions among the German neighbors that Germany again would become a too big and economically maybe too powerful country within Europe. And then the idea of the introduction of a common currency, the euro, was that it would integrate this Germany, which has become bigger and more powerful, better and in a tighter way into Europe. So I also would like to stress, maybe for the sake of discussion later on, in the beginning, German politicians and mainly our then German finance minister, Minister Weigel from Bavaria, he was not very happy about this idea of the euro, because he and other German politicians were very well aware about the shortcomings of this common currency. Namely, it was incomplete without a common financial and economical policy. So, as it has been said, the euro was right from the beginning not based on economical wisdom, but it was a political deal. Our European neighbors, especially France, agreed and welcomed German unification, and Germany, we agreed to the introduction of the euro. And this leads maybe also to an aspect which is easily overlooked here in the United States. The euro is still a political common project, and there is a very strong political will behind most of the European governments to maintain the euro. This is very often overlooked in commentaries, especially here in the United States. There is political will to maintain. What I also would like to stress is very often the current crisis in the media is named or labeled the euro crisis. In fact, we think it's not a euro crisis because the euro itself is not in a crisis. When we look at our common European currency, we can state the currency itself is a success story. Whether we look at the inflation rate or at the exchange rate, the euro has become or was and is very stable. And it has become the world's #2 reserve currency. So the origin of the problem we are facing now goes back to the financial crisis, which started, as a reminder, in 2008, not in one of what is called one of the failed socialist European countries, but this crisis started in the United States. Thank you, United States. And from that time on, governments had to rescue and to shore up national and international bankings with billions of dollars. We, and of course also the American government, we had to put stimulus packages together. And as a consequence, public debt, which was already high before the crisis, increased even more. And in the end, the financial markets questioned whether some euro countries would ever be able to repay these debts. This question is still at the center of the present crisis. And I would say the public debt crisis has turned into what's called sort of crisis of confidence and trust. Germany is of the opinion that the provision of more money, more liquidity alone will not be enough to overcome the crisis. What we need is to convince the markets that the Eurozone will be again an era of financial stability in the future. Now, how to achieve this goal? Now, we think we have put together with our partners the foundations of that stability in the form of 3 pillars. The first pillar is we are demonstrating great solidarity with those Eurozone countries which are in trouble, which are under pressure, which have accumulated a lot of debts. Now that's what behind the permanent European stability mechanism. I don't know, maybe you have heard about it. It was launched officially on Monday, October 8, just 1 month ago, before we had a sort of provisionally similar mechanism. The German Parliament alone has adopted guarantees exceeding far more than 200 billion euros, which means about $250 billion. And if we translate this amount of money in American US dimensions, it means, according to our respective GDP and size of population, that we alone, we Germans, we put together more than $1 trillion. And I wonder, not only I, some German politicians sometimes wonder whether any US government or any US parliament would be ready to guarantee such an amount of money even for one of its own federal states, like let's say California or Illinois, which are also, I think, which have to fight public debt. Now, solidarity was our first pillar. The second of our 3 pillars is that we are generating a new culture of stability. We Germans, we think Europe must move away from public debt, and this is a fundamental shift. Now, this is put into force by the European Fiscal Compact, which is currently being ratified by the European member states. The German Bundestag, the German Parliament, ratified it in July, and maybe you have followed the story, the highest German court, the German Federal Constitutional Court, has agreed in September that the European Stability Mechanism and the Fiscal Compact does not violate the rights of the German Parliament, especially not the right or the principle of no taxation without representation, because we had in Germany some political parties, but also a lot of citizens who thought that Germany or this stability mechanism would start a process where German taxpayers are putting money into bottom line, no, into how do you say, a hole without bottom. Now, the French Parliament ratified the Fiscal Compact beginning of October with a large majority, which again shows that in spite of all the ongoing discussion between France and Germany, and despite the fact that we have sometimes in some question we have different approaches, we are working closely together also with regard to this very complex crisis. So stability was the second of the 3 pillars I try to explain. The third pillar is we try to pave the way for fresh growth in Europe. And this is a point which has been underlined right from the beginning by my
François Hollande.
French colleague, the new president, Hollande, who always said austerity is the wrong way, or it's not the only way. You also have to put some stimulus into the economy, and you have to create growth, which is very true. How to create growth, that's the question. It's the same question here in the United States. No, you are also discussing whether, I don't know, you should create a bigger stimulus, or whether you should start fighting your public debt. It's more or less the same question here in the United States like in Europe. Maybe it's not such an acute crisis here in the United States, but more or less the fundamental questions are the same. Now, we think, or I would like to say, there is money available within some European funds, for example, in the structural and in the cohesion fund. These are around $100 billion available. And also in October, the capital of the European Investment Bank has been increased again by $10 billion. So in fact, there is money available for new investment in crisis countries like Greece, Spain, or Portugal. But then, of course, you have to find also investors who are ready to take this money and to invest. As I mentioned, we Germans, we have the position that more important for individual Eurozone members than money is to become more competitive. We think healthy growth cannot be the product of debt. Growth comes as a product of competitiveness. And you can't buy this by just making more debts. It only can be achieved by structural reforms. And then, of course, it becomes very painful. For example, by liberalizing the labor market, by bringing down unit labor costs, by reducing red tape for business and for investment, slimming down administration, doing away with overprotected businesses, reforming the tax system, and on and on and on. Now maybe you can say, okay, that's easy to say for Germany. But 10 years ago, Germany was the sick man of Europe. Germany went through a very, very deep economical crisis. And then we embarked on a program of structural reforms. It was under our Chancellor Schröder. And these were highly controversial decisions within our government. And we faced also a lot of opposition in our own country. And that is why Germany has a lot of respect for countries which are trying to bring about structural reforms now in their own country. Reforms may be painful, but they pay off. That is what Germany has experienced firsthand, looking back 10 years ago. And that we have observed also in some other European countries, which went through a very tough period of reforms, like, for example, Poland, the Baltic states. They had a very difficult time, also maybe 5 to 8 years ago. They are doing now very well. Poland, for example, has become very successful. The Baltic states also are doing very well. And well, I don't want to exaggerate, but we are observing some positive factors even in the countries which are nowadays very deeply involved in this crisis. For example, unit labor costs increase have come down, and some budget deficits are starting to decrease. And we are seeing even some positive growth rates in cases like in Portugal or in Ireland. During a recent IMF and World Bank meeting in October, it was on October 13 and 14, we could also observe a change. The focus of this meeting, for the first time since quite a year maybe, the focus of this meeting was not anymore the debt crisis of the Eurozone, but interestingly, it was the US fiscal cliff and other topics like, for example, the slow economical growth of BRIC states like Brazil. And I feel this is an encouraging sign for the Eurozone countries. Also in this context, I would like to mention the European Stability Mechanism, which started its operation on October 8. And since then, the European Central Bank started buying bonds from troubled Eurozone member states. And this brought down borrowing costs enormously for countries like Spain and Portugal. So as I said, we can observe some positive elements. Of course, it does not mean that we have put the debt crisis behind us. But I think these very few positive indicators are important incentives to continue with reforms. Germany knows that the end of the debt crisis is nothing we can achieve overnight, but we are making progress. With endurance, we will get there in the end. Sound budget management, growth based on competitiveness and solidarity with our partners, that is the German strategy. I know it's highly controversial. Well, Germany's role in all this has been subject to a lot of scrutiny. If one listens to some of these critical voices, Germany seems to be caught in a sort of dilemma. We are either criticized for being too cautious in addressing the crisis or for being too dominant, dictating our own policies upon others. Germany takes both views seriously. Now, I would like to side with IMF President Lagarde, a French lady, who declared during a recent IMF and World Bank meeting in Tokyo that there is a small path forward and a difficult balance to strike. We should consolidate public debt, but austerity measures must not strangle growth. This is the difficult path and the balance, the right balance to strike. And of course, you can be of different opinions how much to do on one side or on the other side. Germany and Germans are very well aware of a very simple fact. There can be no good future for Germany without a good future for a united Europe. The broad consensus in Germany is that the answer to the current crisis has to be more Europe and a better Europe. not less Europe. So I fully agree with what Graham said, and we are, in a way, we are very much concerned about news like Britain threatens to block banking union and so on, and Britain is considering seriously leaving Europe. We think it's the wrong way. Germany is and will remain deeply and firmly committed to united Europe, not only because of our history, but because of our future. The relative influence of Europe's individual countries, including Germany, upon international politics will continue to decline in the years ahead. The game of global competition is being played on a much larger stage, of course with your country in the center of it, but with China, India, Brazil and other emerging powers becoming stronger economically and politically. And therefore, in our era of globalization, for having a voice in global politics, we think we need a stronger Europe and a better Europe, also for sharing more responsibility with our US partners. Thank you very much.
So the floor is now open to anybody who would like to pose questions, and I'll allow our guests to field those.
Yes, please.
Last week, we had a speaker who also spoke to us on the European Union. And I believe that speaker was saying that the formation of the European Union was for economic purposes primarily and not political, which is what you said. And because she gave the example of the coal, the idea of the trading of the coal between countries was the beginning of the economic union.
But the purpose, maybe I can start, and
Yes.
Graham, you are an expert on it. Of course, it started with, let's say, putting together economical entities, coal and steel. This was the foundation of what has become the European Union. But again, the purpose of putting these industries together was a political one. Very simply, you see, if you put the coal and steel enterprises after the Second World War together under a sort of common direction, it made it impossible that, for example, Germany would start a new war, you see, in building up its own new steel and coal industry and becoming again, I don't know, a sort of belligerent power. So putting it under a common direction, you see, was a political, again, a political deal.
Yes, just to quote from the so-called Schuman Declaration. In this declaration, it stated that, and I quote, "A united Europe was not achieved, and we had war." This was a clear recognition that there would be no lasting peace without a united Europe. And so in this declaration, you have also, and I quote, "To place, France and Germany would like to place their production of coal and steel under a common high authority within the framework of an organization open to the participation of the other countries of Europe." For Schuman, such a bold scheme, and I quote, "makes it plain that any war between France and Germany becomes not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible." So you see, the political purpose was very clear. It was not for economic reason that we tried to set up or to construct the European Union, but it was in fact really the core of the project was to bring peace to the continent and to build on that, to achieve peace beyond Europe. Other question? Yes?
In our recent election here, a lot of attention has been paid to immigration into the United States of minority groups and their influence. And it strikes me that the European Union has made the flow of people, the movement of people between nations easier. And also that ethnic enclaves have formed, probably in both of your countries, that have been involved in politics, but also in public activities that have had political consequences. And so I wonder if you could comment about the effect of membership in the EU on that kind of process, on immigration into your countries, and on the effect it has had on the society as a whole.
That's a complicated question that you have now in Europe to differentiate between European citizens and non-European citizens. For example, you have the liberty to move, to work in the different European countries. In many ways, you're not a foreigner anymore. If you're a German living in France, you're not considered as a foreigner. You don't have to apply for a permit to stay. You don't have to get a visa. You don't have to apply for different administrative regulations. So it's a very different situation. Migration for Europeans today is not the movement of population between EU countries. It's people coming from outside the European Union. That's for us today migration. And it's a real challenge because even if the euro is in crisis, we are still attracting a lot of people coming from poorer countries. And we need to have a sort of common policy, because if somebody is allowed to enter in, I will say, Poland, he can go to Paris and find a job in Paris or apply to a university in Paris. So because we do have a common policy regarding migration and authorization to stay for legal migrants. So it's very challenging to define a policy which will be applied after that on a national basis, because we don't have a European interior ministry. We have different administration, different culture and regulation. So it's quite difficult. A second point is communities. I think you have to be very careful not to apply your American glasses to the European situation. And I have this conversation very often with representatives of the Jewish community. They are asking me, okay, we don't know exactly, because in France you are not supposed to ask what your religion is, but you have about 6 million Muslims. What political power do they have? I said, very little. They are not organized, they are not recognized, and we have a couple of members of parliament which are Muslim, but they are not presenting themselves as Muslim. They are presenting themselves as French citizens of the French Republic. So we don't have the same tradition of community lobbying. And so we don't have a Muslim power or even Muslim representative. In fact, it's very interesting. It was the French government who has asked the Muslim community to get organized. So the French government will have, and the same in Germany, to have a sort of interlocutor. The French government felt the need to talk to the Muslim community, but they were so fragmented that they were not able to do it. So we have set up a sort of committee of Muslim representatives, and when we are trying to work with this committee. So the situation is very different in Europe and in the US, between France and the US, and I suspect the same in Germany, with Germany.
Maybe I would like to add, well, the movement within the European Union, most probably you know, it's really, it has become totally free, without borders, without any controls. And just to give you a very personal example, I have two grown-up children. My son now, he's living and working in Barcelona in Spain. You see, he can move and work wherever he wants within the European Union. And my daughter, she's living in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and she is enjoying there. Free health care without paying anything, and other goodies which are very, let's say, I would say very attractive for what is called European citizens. And what we even observe now as a consequence of these debt crisis, you see, where some countries, especially Greece, Spain, also Portugal, are really in recession or so, we observe, well, some sort of new migration movements. For example, during the last year, I think about 70%, it's not a real migration because it takes place within the European Union, but a lot of people from Greece, from Spain, from Portugal came to Germany in order to look for jobs in Germany. So this has become a very normal way of living. And to some extent, I think it even had some impact of traditional ways of immigration. For example, now many people within the European Union, at the first hand, they don't think to immigrate to traditional countries like the United States, Canada, or Australia, but at first, because it has become so easy, they think, okay, maybe I could look for a better place within the European Union. So this has become, let's say, a sort of mechanism now where we think that the allocation of what's called labor at the end also will help to ease the present difficulties. And Joshua, just one more point, what you mentioned also with minority groups and so on. For you know, maybe we in Germany, we have a big Muslim community, about 4 to 5 million people. Germany has a population of around 80 million people, and most of these peoples are coming from Turkey. And I would say, fortunately for Germany, there are some problems, of course, because they bring these people who came sometimes from places in the interior of Turkey, who have no education, and they bring their own traditions and customs to Germany, and then we have problems like honor killings, which are taking place in Berlin, you see, because, I don't know, the daughter of a Turkish family starts dating, I don't know, his friend without the consent of the family. And this, of course, we have to fight, you see. On the other hand, we have started a process of what we call better integrating minorities in Germany, and we are facing the same problem like the French government. We are trying desperately to have an interlocutor, someone to speak to, someone who really represents the Muslim community. And we have the problem, there are so many different, let's say, wings or different beliefs or sects. You have the Sunnis, you have the Shias, you have the Alawites, which are coming mostly from Turkey, and they don't necessarily form a sort of united representation where you can talk to and where you can start to figure out what has to be done and how to approach or how to address problems. The German government now, for the time being, is very much stressing the need that these immigrants, and especially immigrants from Turkey, should learn German right from the beginning in their early childhood, because we have in Germany, for example, we have now third generation, families of the third generations of Turkish descent, and they don't speak one word of German, you see. So these are some of the problems we are facing.
Yes.
Thank you very
You're
much
sure.
for your presentations, which were really very, very informative. I have maybe a question for both of you. I'll start with Christian. You rightly emphasize in its history that the euro has, since the beginning, always been a political project, as has the project of European integration as a whole. Even though it started through economic integration, they did that because they knew that would be the hard part, or that what they thought would be the hard part. So they did that first, then political integration would follow. That was the hope. But now, it was also, I think, a social project. It happened at the moment of post-war rebuilding, during the period of the Wirtschaftswunder and les Trente Glorieuses in France, the period of post-war rebuilding, when the general consensus among political parties of really both the right and the left in France and Germany was that the state would also be providing a certain base level of social support, of education, of unemployment insurance, of social welfare, of old age pensions. During the first decades of European integration, that worked very well. But now, obviously, we're in a different budgetary environment, we're in a different economic climate, and it seems, one of the things that lies behind the crisis of confidence that European states face is that the social part of state organizations that was so much a part of European integration now seems to be facing extraordinary pressures. That's the beginning. Now, so let me then return to the question of what Germany says to the countries that are so indebted and facing such pressure now. Given the strong emphasis and the promise of social support that was so much a part of European integration along, can you imagine the people in Greece finding it extraordinarily difficult to hear from the more wealthy countries in Europe that austerity is the answer and the only answer to recover your credibility? That is, that the social component is somehow now the economic wisdom will come home to roost in some sense. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you see, as I told already or tried to explain, it's not the austerity is not the only answer. You see, in a way, I think Mrs. Merkel, she got closer to the French partner who demanded right from the beginning we have to create also growth in order to overcome all these problems. On the other hand, with regard to Greece, I fully understand it's a very, very difficult situation for for the Greek population. And of course, Germany is not very well seen, you see, also with our past. And when Angela Merkel, I think 3 weeks ago, went to Athens, but in order to support the Greek government, you see, in order to show some solidarity, of course, there were people in the streets with swastika flags and SR uniforms and so on. On the other hand, I think, you see, we are showing already a lot of solidarity with this country. And again, you see, I think next week, a deadline for Greece is coming for repaying some of its loan, and they most probably are not able to repay their debts. So again, you see, it will be rescheduled, and of course, it again will cost money. So in my country, you see, Mrs. Merkel also has, well, she also has voters on the ground, and she's facing election next year, so she has to take this into account too.
That is the second half of my question. Is it possible to imagine a solution that is, in effect, more Europe, given the shifts in public opinion in places like Germany and France against Europe itself? You know, that there is, I think, an increasing loss of confidence in both, you know, if you look at the election, a significant part of the left and a significant part of the right. You add them together, it's a big chunk of people who have become deeply pessimistic about the European project.
Yeah.
And so if you have national politicians who are trying to find a solution, who are answerable to those electorates.
Yeah. But the Greek government just, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, well, they decided again to push through with some very tough new measures. And well, I'm not a specialist on the Greek economy, but I think some structural reforms are really necessary, you see. I don't know the details, but well, if you are listening to some voices that Greek civil servants can go into retirement at the age of 52 or 55. So a German taxpayer, of course, is asking himself, why should I put out all this money for my Greek colleague who is having a nice life, you see, starting at I don't know, at 52. So it's very delicate.
Just perhaps to answer your question from a different angle, there is sometimes the view in the US that the European countries are doing too much for social benefits, that they are so-called social, socialist countries. But in fact, if you look, it's a different model. It's not better, it's not worse, it's a different model than the US. And some of the most competitive economy in the world are in fact based on very generous socialist or social benefits. Sweden, for example, I think it's the third or the fourth most competitive economy in the world. But in Sweden, you will enjoy free health care and a lot of social benefits that you will not dream of in the US. It's a different model. So that's my first point. Second point, the EU. I think we should also be very clear about the responsibility of our political elite. I will talk only about France, but during too many years, when something was going wrong in France, we are just pointing our finger to Brussels. Those bureaucrats in Brussels were doing bad things, forgetting that in fact, if the bureaucrats in in Brussels were doing bad things. They were just implementing decisions which were taken at political level by the European Council. So there is this very difficult situation that we have national politicians that are answering to their national voters, but basically 50% of their job is doing European politics. And today the split between the parties is very interesting. In fact, it's not between left and right in France. It's between pro and anti-Europe. But this is not today accepted as a real political landscape. So we are still trying to work with old models when the situation basically is very different. So I don't know if we have time to discuss about that, but you have some ideas. For example, Westerwelle, the German Foreign Minister, has set up a sort of informal committee to discuss about the future of the European Union. How could we address such discrepancy between national political systems, which are in fact depending on European decision? Today, the French members of the Parliament, 50% of their job is just putting a sort of rubber stamp to decisions which were taken without any national decision in Brussels. We could not carry on like that. You have questions about the way European Union is working, about what we call the democracy deficit. We need to address that. We are trying, we have made progress with the Lisbon Treaty, but as I said at the beginning of my talk, it's a process. And we are just at the beginning of this process. We have not achieved the construction of the European Union right now. We are just at the beginning. It will take time, as in fact the construction of the United States takes a lot of time before you were able to find the right balances between the different powers, different states, and so on.
Yeah, when you go back to your own history in the United States, it took, I don't know, more than 50 or 100 years. No, you had one civil war before you put all the pieces together and before you struck the right balance between what sort of power should be on the federal level and what sort of power should be on the state federal level and so on. So sometimes, well, it sounds maybe it's difficult, but sometimes you have also to show some patience, you see, to fiddle out all these very difficult and complex questions. And in Europe, it's more complex and more difficult than in the United States, because we have this very old tradition of different countries, different languages, different states, which went to war against each other more than, I don't know, how many times, you see. So so it's not easy, and I think nobody from our side is proning or proposing any simplistic way in addressing all these problems. It will take its time, and it will be a rocky way forward, and but still I'm a convinced European.
Yes.
Do you anticipate Europe will become a federation like United States sometime in the future? Would Europe become a federal structure like United States in some time in the future?
Yeah, maybe I still have the hope. Anyway, that's the German approach, I would say, or the German majority approach. It will take some time. You see, like Graham just mentioned, the German foreign minister, Mr. Westerwelle, he has formed now for more than a year a sort of informal discussion group how a future Europe could look like, you see. And then, of course, he's developing some ideas which are maybe German German-style ideas, you see. But just to give you a rough idea about what he's thinking what you mentioned, to overcome the democracy deficit. The role of the European Parliament should be strengthened. It should be developed into a real parliament which has a say in controlling the decision-making policy on the European level. He thinks as a second chamber of the European Parliament, like here in the United States you have the Senate representing your federal states, you see, the Council of Europe, which is now representing the head of states and governments, and which takes the highest decisions. So the Council of Europe should become a sort of Senate in a future European structure, and the European Commission should become the executive arm, the executive administration of this structure, and the European President should be elected by popular vote. You see, this could be just one idea how to go forward. I think it's important to create ideas in order to have, you see, a sort of basis where you can discuss about, you see, where you can exchange opinion, you see, whether you would like to have it, or what sort of, I don't know, different ideas
This is a very interesting example how between France and Germany we have to work together, because of course for Germany this federal project is very easy to understand, because Germany is a federal state, so they know what it means to have a second chamber representing the states. For France, it's something very difficult to understand. It's for the time being, I will say, anathema. But that will mean that we will have to work with the Germans to understand what they want to achieve, and the Germans will have to understand that for a very old and strongly rooted state like France, the role of the state, of the nation, should be in some ways preserved or protected. So we will find something, I don't know what, but we'll find something that will be very strange from the outside, I'm sure, but that will be a solution that will balance the different approaches. And I'm quite sure that if France and Germany are able to define this strange political animal, the others will say, why not? If the French and German agree, because they have started from such a different point of view, it should be a sort of middle ground. But it's not for today, neither, and not for tomorrow. Yeah, it's a process. It's a process. Other questions? Yes, please.
Now that the election has been decided in the U.S., so we know sort of the political climate here for the next 4 years, I was wondering if you could comment, or if you have an idea of an area in which you would like to see the U.S. pay more attention to in terms of U.S.-EU relations. So one specific area you think the U.S. has not paid as much attention to that needs more effort or cooperation or economic resources?
I think there is an interesting press release about the trade agreement between EU and the US. Germany, I think it was Chancellor Merkel, who a couple of years ago referred first to the necessity to do even more, even if we are in fact the first trade partner, to do even more, and to try to achieve even more between the US and Europe. You have all these economic aspects which are very important. But from my point of view, I think political aspects are also important. And as we were able to do that, to do it between France and Germany, I think it will be good if the EU and the US will have the habit to consult on a very systematic basis. That doesn't mean that we will follow the US, that all the US will have to follow the EU, but we need really a sort of a mechanism to have consultations. Today, we do have such mechanism on a bilateral basis. Most of the important decisions are taken with some consultation with the US. But I will say it's in the corridors. Some countries are more active than others, some less. And so this situation is not, from my point of view, very healthy. And we need to have a mechanism for consultation between the US and Europe at a political level. We have what we call the EU-US summit once a year. But in fact, it's not consultation. It's exchange of views. We are trying to solve some issues. But what I'm talking about is a day-to-day consultation, that when something is happening, we just give a call to Brussels. And but the question remains, who to call in Brussels? So Kissinger is still haunting us.
Do you have any other questions? Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for your attention.